Hello, history buffs, and welcome again to History 2752 Social Movements in U.S. History. I thought I'd take you outside on this beautiful day to give you an introduction and run through to some of the primary historical needs we'll have as we go through this class. So, if any of you have taken a history course before, you'll know that there are two main types of sources: primary and secondary. Primary sources are documents or physical objects. This is written or created during a time of study. So these are really important when we think about having something tangible from that era. It could be a diary, a speech, manuscript, letter, interview, something as interesting as an article of clothing, but it can also be creative works like poetry, drama, novels, music, art, or even buildings, or pottery, or furniture. Really, the list goes on, and again, this gives you a sense of something that's primary, a first sort of tangible step from that era. Secondary, right? We have this idea of something that's secondary. These secondary sources interpret and analyze primary sources. So these are a step at least, or more, removed from a primary source, even though sometimes secondary sources can have primary sources within them. So we can think about these secondary sources as being something like textbooks, or magazines, articles, critiques, encyclopedias, all kind of examples of secondary sources. Something that's interesting to think about is this point of reference we have for an era as well, right? So if we look at a textbook from 1900, and during the 1900 time, that would be a secondary source then, but if we want a primary source from that era of 1900 to determine what the era was like, that textbook from 1900 would then become a primary source if we're looking back from now. So just something to keep in mind. It's all really relational too. So besides sources, I really want to get into social construction with you all too, because this is the crux of what we'll be talking about as a class. A lot of social construction is changing throughout U.S. history, and it's the reason a lot of social movements occur. So three things that are socially constructed in the United States, and we're going to really get into, are race, class, and gender. Race is socially constructed. What it means to be one race or another race is changing always, and it has changed over time. It has been socially constructed historically. And we can involve this in cultural dimensions and also phenotypical dimensions, is how people perceive it, which means how somebody looks, right? At various times, people have, and many still do, believe that race is biologically determined and that it cannot change. And that is racism at its heart, right? For class, this is the economic position of somebody or a group of people within a given society. We've all heard of the terms middle class, upper class, lower class, right? And someone can be in working class too. You could be a capitalist or a worker, a service sector employee working in the food industry, or a Wall Street financial analyst. This is socially constructed because our economic system is constantly changing. It's functioned differently across history, and this means that class changes too. Gender. Gender is a social construct that defines what it means to be a man or a woman, a male or a female, to have masculinity or femininity. This is different than sex, which is understood as a biological component of the two things. So in talking about social construction, this doesn't mean that any of the definitions, meanings, or ideas are not real or that they are fake, but every day, every one of us makes all of our decisions based on socially constructed meanings of things. We see a tree is a tree. A coffee cup is a coffee cup, but these are socially constructed meanings. All of these ideas that we've gone over concern politics and who has the power to decide what things are and who doesn't, right? In sort of going through more of the course, we're going to be focusing on three main movements that will really be framed throughout the course. We have labor unions, feminism, and freedom struggles. So as we talk about these three movements, they're all concerned broadly with concepts that a lot of groups throw around. This idea of freedom, equality, inclusion, rights, liberty, and citizenship. So these movements all make mistakes, but they also make efforts to improve lives and the lives of other Americans. We're going to see the nation split over the role of women time and time again, and how it's not so simple to rally around gender when race, sexuality, and class are all involved. So we're going to see that throughout the feminist movement. We'll also see conflict between capital and labor. Workers will go on strike against railroad corporations, which is kind of the first big business. They're going to go on strike against automotive industry, and really there's going to be a lot of violence we'll see in this idea of labor movements. And we'll also follow the long freedom movement among African Americans, which kind of goes from slavery to freedom. We'll watch as blacks and other people of color assert their right to inclusion, to legal equality, and finally to the equality of opportunity. Each of these movements are interrelated. For example, black women fought for civil rights while also fighting for their equality as women. At times, sometimes they even fought to join a union, too. All three of these movements are going to face internal conflicts amongst the members making up the social movement and external threats. So there's a lot of counter movements going on, which we'll talk about as well. Finally, getting to the meat of this course too, we're going to try to argue something to you in this course and try to convince you of something by the end. You can challenge me on it, but I think that these are the main things it takes to make a successful social movement in the United States. You need strong ideological convictions that are not at odds with republicanism and capitalism. You need persuasive rhetorical appeals, political savvy. You have to downplay internal and cross-movement divisions. You need to work with at least one other significant social movement or use another movement's strategies. You need to target state-level reforms and then expand your scope broadly. Finally, you also need to be successful by expanding this definition of American equality to include more people than it had before. And so in all of this, there's also 4 characteristics that I think we'll see time and time again in these social movements. And that will be that they'll have to be collective, sustained, organized, and have some sort of effort to create or avoid change. And all of this information as well, I will be posting in a PowerPoint slide below, so feel free to sort of constantly go back to these ideas as we look at each movement throughout social history. So I really appreciate your time in sort of this intro, and I'll look forward to talking more about movements after this. Thank you.